The scripture, the scripture that we just read was from Luke chapter 4, and really it could be summarized as the gospel message, if you really wanted to get very technical about it. But I wanted to talk about independence today. Coming off of our nation's Independence Day, it prompts a question, I believe, surrounding the meaning of independence. Not just national independence, but even personal independence. What does it look like? I remember as a child, my mom taking my sister and me to a fireworks celebration at a nearby lake where we grew up in Oklahoma. We were very young. I'm not even sure of the age. I mean, I could have been 5 years old or so, 6. The memories are vivid, but there's some little missing parts for sure. But what stands out most in my mind from that moment of kind of this beautiful festivities, it was really the first fireworks show that I remember. There were two things. The first being this, no doubt just the sheer excitement that any child would have when they're going to witness their first major fireworks show and something they'd only seen on TV. That's what I remembered. And the other thing that stood out in my mind was the meeting of two young twins, a boy and a girl. They were about the same age as my sister and me. And they had a condition, and it was unique. I had never seen this before or heard about it, in which their skin lacked pigmentation. They were both born with albinism. It was the first time we had met twins before, let alone someone with that particular skin condition or genetic condition. And I remember not quite understanding what it was, and my mom whispering to me, they're albinos, which to me sounded like rhinos, and so that was the picture that immediately came to my head. I didn't make any sense what was being said to me about it, but so my mom stopped, whispering into my ear and just let us go on. And we carried on. We were playing together. The kids wore special sunglasses, and of course they had, almost luminescent skin. It was super white, but it was very luminescent. And it was in the evening. It was after dusk, and so they seemed to be in their element. Like they had been waiting and anticipating all day just to be able to go out and play. So they explained that to my sister and me the best that they could, that they were just now being able to go outside. So we didn't understand it. We didn't, we just knew sunburns and we didn't know anything else. But these kids were in their element. I mean, the evening was their time, and it was during the day they suffered, and I just wasn't quite understanding it all in my young mind, but I knew something was unique about it. And it was so ironic as I think back about it, because these two kids were so excited, not just because the fireworks that were about to happen, which we were all excited about, but because they were able to play outside. For them, this was freedom. This was really personal independence happening on Independence Day, which was pretty amazing. And I remember into the night, as the fireworks show was about to get started, it was later in the evening, maybe 10 or something. It was pretty late. And I remember as a kid, I was just passing out in my mom's arms or something. And I was falling asleep as the fireworks show was beginning. And these kids were so jazzed. I mean, they were wide awake and ready to enjoy it. And they were dancing and having fun. And I was just kind of conking out. But thinking back on it, they were free. These kids were free. I mean, they were experiencing freedom. And I didn't even understand what that was, what they had experienced, because I didn't understand what they went through every single day. Our nation was formed out of rebellion from its own oppressors, while ironically, this new nation was simultaneously oppressing others. It is the irony of our past. It is the strangeness of our existence, of our beginning and current state. In many ways, it still maintains a system that has continued to do the very thing that it hopes not to do for many of us. We try a lot of times to not, I think, as we think about things, we try not to oppress or want to be oppressing any vulnerable group. I using our and we is a very general nationalistic language. Really, it's majority culture speaking to say we would rather not have a nation that's oppressing anyone at any time, right? But the truth is that oppression does exist, and we don't understand everyone's situation because we haven't lived it or we didn't grow up in it. And so, but when we discover it, we try quickly to rectify it. And so there's this piece of trying to fix it with Band-Aid fixes. It's kind of like, though, putting toothpaste or trying to put toothpaste back in the tube, and really we're not dealing with the real problem. And I think for me personally, as I'm looking through the systems here, there's systemic issues by large and far that need to truly be either changed or done away with completely. At the same time, as a pastor or leader of a faith community, I can't help but think that there must be a deeper transformation within the heart of our culture. And when I'm speaking of our culture, again, it's majority culture that I'm speaking about. We must change. There's things that just definitely have to change. In Jesus's gospel, he was dealing with something very, very similar. And that's the thing that I wanted to share today. I know it may boggle some of our minds that Jesus was dealing with racial issues. And the truth is that he was, right from the very beginning. That part where I mentioned the people were enraged. In Luke chapter 4, which we just read, Jesus is laying out a path forward that's not centered on majority culture, which he was of majority culture in that sense, who he was talking to his audience. And it's tough. I mean, standing up with your peers or people from your own tribe or people from your own group who are oppressed by a system, much like the Americans or the colonists of the time were oppressed by Britain, their imperial power as well, but at the same time are oppressing others. And this is just kind of our story. This is our human tragedy, that we begin to oppress one another. We are oppressed and we oppress, and that's kind of seems to be our cyclical life, our life cycle, if you will. We continuously seem to be engaged in some sort of form. And here Jesus is he's talking about the same thing. He's talking to the majority culture, and he says, listen, we must put aside the empowerment that we have as the people in power, and instead focus on those who are really being oppressed around us. And when he explained that to his own people, he gave precedence. He used the prophets of old to describe it. And he said that Elijah, the prophet Elijah, the revered prophet Elijah, had himself, while during a famine, left his people and spent time with a foreign widow and her son. And God blessed them with food. He brought food to the impoverished, but it wasn't his own people. And then it talks about, and then he says, Elisha, the other prophet, which could be easily confused, Elisha and Elijah, for us, they sound the same, just because we're saying it in English. But for Elisha, it was another issue of healing, where he heals somebody outside of his race. He heals a Syrian, a leper. And again, he is saying that God is calling him to a ministry or to a life of those who are being oppressed around him, which is all of these vulnerable people within his own race, but also the races around him that are being oppressed. And people were upset about it. It's so much so that this is like the first instance where Jesus is being targeted to be killed. And all he's saying is, we need to focus on the oppressed, not on ourselves. We need to look at the oppressed and put our energies there. We are not the center of God's universe. We are all God's children. And we need to be with those who are hurting and find a sacrificial way to live into their own experience and help where we can, leverage the power we've been given. Jesus says to preach the good news to the poor. And the actual word in the Greek is evangelize, which nowadays means something almost entirely different. When people talk about evangelizing another person, it does mean something obviously different than when Jesus was using it. I don't think anyone can totally disagree with that, because Jesus is using it in a context that's very, very specific. And he says to evangelize or preach this good news to the poor. And then he goes on from there. It's a list of things, right? But what does he mean when he says preach the good news to the poor? Well, obviously Jesus doesn't mean simply speaking to the poor. If that's what Jesus meant, then that it isn't seen in Jesus's own ministry, his own life. His own life is about sacrifice. I mean, it's about feeding the poor, being with the poor, being poor. It's about living hand to mouth. And it's also about constantly challenging the establishment that seems to seems to favor the rich and to discriminate against the poor. So like the laws that would say not to take grain, for example, or to take food on the Sabbath day if it requires any work. And so Jesus challenged all of these laws because they seem to favor the rich and to discriminate against the poor. Jesus was tearing down the establishment. We see that in his life. It was more than just words. We see it when Jesus also is living, and he's living out in a homeless state. Remember when one person asked Jesus, I want to follow you, or how can I follow you, or something like that. And Jesus responds, the foxes have holes, the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And it makes it very clear. Jesus is homeless. He's homeless, and he's making it clear. If you're going to follow me, you have to understand you're going to be living into this impoverished experience. I mean, that's pretty wild. The Lord, the one we call Lord, the one that many of us follow, we say we're Christians or followers of the Christ, yet we don't even seem to really acknowledge the suffering that Jesus endured, this living into the poverty experience. I mean, it was radical. Jesus said he would proclaim freedom for the captives. He didn't stop with the poor. He said, I'm going to proclaim freedom for the captives. But if anything is any indication of what Jesus lived into, we know it wasn't just words of proclaiming freedom. Jesus actually demonstrated it. Healing of the blind, he says. Release for the oppressed. So healing, we know. Well, Jesus was a healer. We know that. So Jesus would heal people physically and emotionally and mentally. Jesus was a healer. But Jesus did so much more than that. He brought relief to them over and over when no one else would. And ironically, when he did heal his own people, they weren't always as grateful as those of other races were. As he points out in the healing of the 10 lepers, it says only out of the 10 lepers, one returned to say thank you. And it was a Samaritan. Jesus understood that going out and loving people that were outside of his own tribe, his own group, would have costs. He knew that this would enrage people from his own race. And he always took flack for it. Not only race, but his own class, his own religious group, for example. And so constantly Jesus was having to face that, this condemnation coming from the top, this condemnation coming from his peers. But that was just how Jesus lived into the experience of those who really needed him. And when confronted with it, he would even say, things like, doesn't the physician need to be with the sick instead of the well? And that kept his peers kind of happy. It placated them because they're like, oh yeah, that's right. We have it all together. You don't need to be with us. You need to be with them. This idea of otherization, Jesus played into their own prejudices. Jesus got physically upset. Remember that? And the week before he was killed, Jesus overthrew the money changers' tables. These were people of his own race, of his own tribe, his own people, his own religion. But they were doing something terrible. They were taking advantage of the poor, of the foreigner. They were doing this massive money exchange system where they were taking literally money from these desperate people on pilgrimage. And it was people outside, the others again. And Jesus even says, he says, you have taken my Father's house that was a house of prayer for all nations, and you've made it into a den of thieves. And so the whole idea was that Jesus is saying, you've taken something that was sacred and meant for the whole world, and you've made it just about you at the detriment of these other people, these other races. Jesus is proclaiming a freedom. Jesus is proclaiming a true compassion that lives into those who are suffering the most. How do we do it is probably the biggest question most of us have. Dan, how can we truly live into this freedom of others? I mean, and I just wanted to give some framework, just like I kind of learned the lesson, I believe, or just in reflection of the lesson I learned in that first 4th of July remembrance that I have as a child. Loving others requires, number one, listening to their experiences without judgment. You have no idea what they've gone through or what they're going through. So you have to listen, and that means to be quiet. When people are sharing their experiences, it means, though you may want to make a commentary on their experience, or feel like you have to say something that you've had another terrible experience to try to relate. The idea is that we need to be quiet and listen to those experiences. And I appreciate everyone for doing that. We've been listening to several speakers that have come here, friends of ours, and that have shared out of their experiences as Black men, queer Black men, and their experiences among Christians, their experiences on the street, their experiences in life. And I appreciate you all listening. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to listen. Number two, which I regret now, but just thinking back as a child, don't fall asleep when they need you to be awake. I think about those children and how they were living into that fireworks celebration experience at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and how me as a child was falling asleep. I had been playing all day. They were just waking up for their time of playing at the nighttime because of their skin condition. And we need to be awake. It is not time to sleep. And it is so easy to sleep. Don't tell me it's not. It is so much easier to tune out, to close our eyes, to turn off everything and just not be aware of what's happening. But the truth is that people right now need us to step up and to live into their experiences fully awake. Number three, join in side by side, living into that experience, embodying others who are experiencing pain and joy, and experience it with them as much as possible. And that means reaching out. That means being present with others who are suffering. And number four, let's work to create conditions that are in our control to enable true, equitable freedom for everyone. And that's going to take work. These are the things I want to encourage us as a community. And as we listen to the experiences of some of our friends like LaCroix and Quan and Chris, who were sharing these past few weeks, think about each of their experiences, each of what they brought. I mean, they're in the midst of doing things, being who they are. And my challenge and question for us is, are we willing to set aside ourselves and sacrificially find ways to live into those experiences?